Hey, we're glad you're here. Welcome to the second part of a three-part series entitled Monopolize. And what we're talking about wealth. And this week, every week we have a different subject. Last week we talked about before you roll. And like with any game, you need to know what the rules are before you begin your game. And we talked about some of the rules of Monopoly and how they applied to how God wants us to use our wealth and live within our wealth. And what we discovered last week was that when it comes to our wealth, that God wants something for us, not something from us, and that we need to keep that in the forefront of our mind. Once again, Monopoly was invented by a man named Charles Darrow in 1934 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Something I didn't say in the early service is that every property on the Monopoly board is literally a street in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Those are all real places, and all of them are streets except for one property, which is Boardwalk. Today's lesson is entitled BALTIC or Boardwalk. And I didn't choose those two properties because they both begin with a B and they rhyme and all that. That's just a happy coincidence, okay? I chose them for a very different reason. This lesson really is about living within your means. And BALTIC and Boardwalk are the two greatest paradoxes in the game of Monopoly as far as their values. When you look at these cards, Baltic Avenue costs $60 if you buy it when nobody else owns it. Boardwalk will cost you $400. Baltic is the very first property you can possibly land on, although it's not the first property on the board. Mediterranean is the first property, but you can't roll a 1 with 2 dice. So the very first property you can land on is Baltic, and it's the least expensive at $60. Boardwalk, on the other hand, is the very last property that you can land on, and it is the most expensive property on the board at $400. Now remember, you start the game with $1,500. Now you have to consider all these things when you're playing the game, and that is that the average roll of the dice is 7. And there are 40 spaces on a Monopoly board. More than likely, with their 28 pieces of property, more than likely you'll only have the opportunity at most to purchase 4 pieces of property on your first trip around the board. And so you want to be very judicious about how you use your wealth. You want to be able to live within your means. Now, the reason these two properties are paradoxes is, in theory, they are the best properties on the board, in theory. And the reason they're the best properties on the board, in theory, is because when you max out your investment in these properties, the rate of return on Baltic Avenue or the amount of improvement in Baltic Avenue is 76.4%. The only one better than that is Boardwalk at 76.8%. That all sounds good. The problem is, statistically, they are the worst properties on the board because you only collect rent when someone else lands on your property. And they are the least landed upon spaces on the entire board statistically. So if you look at it one way, they're the best property, but you look at it the other way, they're the worst property. And what I'm trying to say is that we have to look at life the same way. We have to understand that we have to make judicious decisions when it comes to how we deal with our means. Now, I always buy Boardwalk. Tell you why. Because I never buy it to keep it. I always buy it to sell it, because people get really, really greedy as soon as they land on Park Place. They'll see Park Place and they'll think, man, if I get Boardwalk, I get all those hotels, dude, I'm going to rack up. And I have sold Boardwalk to people for up to 80% of their entire wealth. And within the next circle around the board, they will go bankrupt. And why does that work? It works every time, by the way. Why does that work? Because it has to do with the very first rule of life. We all do stupid things to ourselves. It's true, isn't it? I mean, when it comes to financial things, haven't you done things sometimes that were just really stupid? When it comes to personal things, haven't you done things that are just really, really stupid? An extreme example of this. A couple years ago, there was a television show on the Discovery Channel called Eaten Alive. I don't know how many of you saw this, but let me explain it to you because it's kind of gross. It was a show about people being eaten alive by animals. You with me so far? And there was one particular episode, and it's the only one that I actually saw. There was a guy named Paul Rizzoli who decided that he was going to be eaten alive by an anaconda snake. And so he created an outfit to protect himself because he planned on living through this experiment. And this is what he looked like. Kind of a human suppository, I guess. That's what he was wearing as he went in. Now, before the snake ate him, I didn't watch it happen because I'm terrified of snakes and I would not have slept for 2 weeks if I'd have seen this. And by the way, he and the snake survived this ordeal. But before he was eaten by the snake, he said this: the secret to being eaten by an anaconda is to be eaten head first. How did he know that? Did he talk to all the anaconda survivors? Here's what I'm getting to. When I was watching this guy put on this silly uniform, being prepared to be eaten alive by a snake, it reminded me of the very first words of every bad decision I've ever heard being a young man growing up in the South. And that is, hey, y'all, watch this. You know what I'm talking about. You've had that, hey, y'all, watch this moment. Why? Because we all do stupid things to ourselves. And guys, it's not just us. The first, hey, y'all, watch this moment was a woman. We read the book of Genesis, chapter 2. The Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. Let me set this up for you. Adam and Eve have been created. They're in this garden, the Garden of Eden. It is paradise. And what I mean by paradise, when you hear me say paradise, what paradise really means is this: that everything they could possibly ever need was supplied right there in that location. Now, if you're with me so far, shake your head. Okay? They'd been placed in paradise. Everything they possibly need is there. And he says, you can have anything you want here, but don't eat from that tree. And so we turn the page, and we read in chapter 3, the serpent said to the woman, you surely will not die. For God knows that in the day that you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Anybody know how the story goes? Eve promptly pulls the fruit off the tree and says, hey, y'all, watch this. And a whole cycle of bad things begins with that really, really bad decision. But you know what she was really doing? She was saying that paradise is not enough. An example. I got these 2,000-piece puzzles up here, and I chose this one. If I were going to put one of these together, I would put this one together. It's a beautiful picture. If you can't see it from the back, it's a villa, and I'm going to assume it's in France because that's where I want it to be, okay? And it's got all these beautiful flowers, and there are 1,000 pieces to this puzzle right here. And then there's another piece of the puzzle. There's another puzzle. It's a beautiful scene too, deer, barns, all that good stuff. But I want you to imagine that your life is this 1,000-piece puzzle. That there's a lot of little intricate parts to your life, and that in order to live your life, what God has done is He has created something in you that is truly beautiful, but what you're going to do is that you're going to live it out through these 1,000 pieces of puzzle, okay? You're going to continue to live your life out. Everything that you ever need to be this beautiful picture, God has put in this box for you, these 1,000 pieces. But you decide, look at that other picture. I really like that color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that piece and I'm going to put it in my puzzle box. I didn't really throw it in there. All you OCD people are out there going, no, you'll never find that piece. That's what we do in life. That's what happens when paradise is not enough. We have everything that we need. We have all 1,000 pieces that we need in order to live the life that God has called us to live. But sometimes we see something that someone else has, something in someone else's puzzle box. And we want to take that piece of the puzzle and we want to place it in our life. And you know what happens when you place a piece from another puzzle in your puzzle? It never fits, and it never looks good. And pardon this expression, it will be jinky the rest of your life. Why? Because we always ruin our lives when we try to put someone else's puzzle in our puzzle. When we try to fit something that doesn't belong in our life into our life. Because God has given us our own paradise. He has created our own picture, and within all of us, we have everything that we need in order to be all that God has created us to be. You see, too often we exchange the world of sufficiency for the world of excess. And as if paradise, which paradise is, once again, a place or having everything that God needs you to have as if paradise is not enough. And we live in a world that exchanges sufficiency for a world of excess. Last week I used this phrase. You know, so many times we spend money that we don't have on things that we don't need to impress people we don't like. You know, there's an addendum that should go on the end of that, and that is to fulfill a lifestyle that we can't support. That's what happens when we don't live within our means. Not only do we spend money that we don't have on things that we don't need to impress people we don't like, but it creates a lifestyle that we can't sustain. And the reason is that we have a weird idea of what we really, really need. As a matter of fact, we struggle deciding what we really, really need. U.S. News and World Report, I think it was last year, did a survey of the happiest countries in the world. And they surveyed the countries across the globe. You'll never guess which was the happiest. If you were in the first service, don't you say it. It was the happiest country in the world. It was Nigeria. Isn't that amazing? This is a place where they rarely have running water and they don't have enough food. And Nigeria was the happiest country in the world. The United States ranked number 16. And then they did another survey of the highest standards of living in the entire world. Guess who was number one? U.S., as in us. Right? Nigeria was number 162. And you have to ask yourself this. How can number 162 be the happiest people in the world? It's because they've learned a secret that we have often forgot. And that is, having enough really is enough. The sufficiency, when you can't imagine excess, sufficiency is all you really need. The Apostle Paul wrote this to the church at Philippi. He says, I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. And in any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. You know, contentment's one of those New Year's resolution words. You know, this year I will be more content. It's not something we really chase after. But the reality is that true contentment is enough being enough. True contentment is saying, whatever God has put in my puzzle box is enough for me. And that I know when enough is enough, and I can live a life of excellence without living a life of excess. And the Bible proves this to us. You see, we have to believe, if we're going to live within our means, we have to believe that we have a God of sufficiency, that all the pieces of the puzzle are in the box. That whether we choose BALTIC or BOARDWALK, whatever it is that God has planned for us, all the pieces of that puzzle, all the pieces of that painting are in the box, and we have to understand that we have a God who really can supply our needs. He's a God of sufficiency. Now, a couple of examples I want to use this morning. First example is from a parable that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. It's the parable of the prodigal son. And the parable of the prodigal son, basically there are three main characters. They just kind of catch you up on that. There's the prodigal son who takes half his father's wealth, goes out, blows it, comes back, father forgives him. There's the father who's the forgiving father, this image of the Almighty God, how he forgives mankind. But there's another character in this story. It's the character that quite shamefully for me, I relate to more than the other two. I can relate to all of them, but I relate to this one more. It's the older brother. The older brother stays with his dad, works the farm, does his job, and then when the other brother comes back, he's angry. He's angry and he won't celebrate with his other brother. And so the father goes to him because he doesn't understand why he can't celebrate this brother who was lost and is now found. And he goes to him and he wants to know what's going on. And the older brother starts this tirade. I have been with you the whole time. I've worked hard, and you never even gave me a goat to party with my friends. And then you need to see the father's response. Luke 15:31. Son, you've always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. In other words, he's saying, son, you've always had everything you needed. It's always been right here in front of you. So why was he not happy? It wasn't that he didn't have enough. It's that he couldn't find joy in what he had. You see, the first step of financial godliness is living joyfully within the provision of God. This paradise that you have, the pieces that are in the box, we have to learn to celebrate and live joyously within the paradise, within the provision that we have. Second example is not just prodigal son, but there's a book in the New Testament where an old preacher, Paul, is writing to this young preacher named Timothy. And he's giving him a lot of advice on how to deal with these people in this place called Ephesus, where he's tending a church there, ministering to a church there. And basically, to understand what Paul is saying to Timothy that we're about to read, you have to understand where he is and what Ephesus is all about. Ephesus was the home city of the Greek god Artemis. And Artemis was the goddess of hunting and fertility, the goddess of harvest. And people would come from miles around so they could worship at this altar of Artemis. And the people who lived in Ephesus made a living off of Artemis. They would carve little idols for people that would come into town, and they would make their livelihood selling these gods to the people who came through. And basically, as Paul is speaking to Timothy, he's letting him know, I get what's happening here. You're living in a culture that makes its livelihood from people who worship things. Let that marinate just a second. You're living in a culture that makes its livelihood from people who worship things. Sound familiar? We live in a culture that makes its livelihood from people worshiping things. And so what does he say to Timothy? But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation, a snare, many foolish, harmful desires, which plunge them into ruin and destruction. He's talking about people who pursue wealth, not wealthy people, but people who pursue wealth, that they go into ruin and destruction. We see it all around us, don't we? I didn't use this illustration in the first service, but I got a little time in this one. I'm running ahead of schedule, which is unprecedented. The average salary, minimum salary, actually not the average salary, the minimum salary in the National Football League is $450,000 a year. It's a lot of money, isn't it? To stand on the sideline and hold a clipboard, that's a lot of money. The average, actually 78% of all NFL players within 2 years of retirement file bankruptcy. Isn't that amazing? Why? Because we live in a culture that makes its living off worshiping things. You see, that's kind of who we've become. That's why BOARDWALK is such a valuable piece for someone who doesn't plan to keep it. Because you can use it as a bargaining chip to destroy someone with their own greed. But those people who learn to be content with godliness, they have experienced great gain. The quest for excess is what leads us to being monopolized, not living within our means, but wanting to have more than is in our 1,000-piece box. So how do we learn to live joyfully with God's provision? That's a real question. I want to show you a graph, and it's not a graph that I came up with. Dr. Casey Tigert, who does financial seminars, came up with this, and I thought that it would apply here. If we were wanting to talk about how do you live within your means, this would be a good way to do it. So I've got a graph. You got column A, column B, and column Q. No, C. I just want to see if you're still with me. Column C. And in column A, and sometime today, I hope you'll go home and you'll kind of fill one of these out. Column A, I want you to think about the things that you need. And that means things that without them you'll probably perish, okay? Things like food, clothing, yes, you need clothing, shelter, transportation. Now, I put transportation there. If you have a job to do it, you're going to need that, okay? Column A, what you need. Column B Column B are the things that bring us joy. They're not things that necessarily that we need, but they bring joy to our life and their excitement and things like that. For me, my list would include books and my motorcycle. I actually was reading an article this week, 20 things that a pastor should not love too much. And one of those things was your motorcycle. And I just stopped reading because he was being paid by the word, obviously. Motorcycle, television, guitars, for me it's plural, I've got 7, etc. Things that bring us joy. Then the next column, column C, is things that are neither A nor B. They're not a need and they don't bring you joy, but they're things that you have. And these could be things like your golf clubs. Listen, I don't play golf, but I have golf clubs. You're welcome to come get them. I'll give them to you because if I want to be in that kind of frustration, I'll just stick a fork in my own eye. I'll get it over with. All right, golf clubs. Your big house. Do you really need a house that big? Do you need the vehicle that you have? Guitars. I put that in there plural because I have 7 guitars and 2 hands and you can only play one at a time. So what do you really, really need? Okay? And then you bring that list together. You have the things you need, the things that you don't need, but probably bring joy to your life, and then the things that don't do either one of the two. And those are things that you probably need to think about doing something about. Here's why. You see, living within God's provision requires us to evaluate. We have to sit down and take stock of everything around us. If we're going to create a plan in order to win this game, we have to evaluate things around us. That's why we go to A to B to C. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 32 and 33, it says the Gentiles actually seek all those things, but your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. And I read that because I want you to understand God knows what you need and He has supplied. God will supply all your needs. Everything you need is in the box. But seek His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Okay, so evaluate. Realize that God has what you need. Seek His kingdom and His righteousness, and those things will be added to you. The next thing you need to do is to edit. You need to take this list, and once you've got this list and you've evaluated the list, then you need to edit. You're going to realize, once you look at it really carefully, that there are things in column A that really should be in column B, and things in column B that should be in column C, and you may want to move some of those things around. And here's something that's going to help you edit that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12, we're told this. It says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All these things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And here's why I bring that up. When we make these lists and we start thinking, evaluating our life and editing this list, we're not looking for things that are sinful. We're looking for things that are good but not great. We're trying to choose best over better. You see where I am? It's not necessarily a sin, but we're also trying to look for the things that, although they're not necessarily bad, they have the potential to master our lives. And we need to move those things over into item and to column C. And then the last thing is we need to execute. You have to evaluate, you have to edit, and you have to create execution. No plan is any good. Nothing frustrates me as a leader anymore than to set and map out a plan and not see it through. Not run the play. It drives me crazy. And so what we need to do is we have to deal with column C. Maybe we need to sell Boardwalk and buy BALTIC. I don't know what your column C is, but you have to deal with the things in that column. We don't have to be people who settle. We can live a life of excellence, but we should not want to live a life of excess. And now, before next week, I'm going to tell you how you win at Monopoly. There's one surefire way, or at least it increases your odds drastically. You see, BALTIC and Boardwalk really are neither one the best properties, okay? They're not the best properties. The best properties on the board, if you can get this block of properties, your chances of winning go up astronomically if you invest in these properties. Are you ready? It is St. James Avenue, New York Avenue, and Tennessee Avenue. They're right there on the corner of the board. They are the middle range price properties. And you know why they are the most important properties? Because people land on them 30% more than any other property because of their proximity to jail, which is why they're orange and one of them's Tennessee. No, just kidding. You have to roll doubles to get out of jail. And if you roll doubles and get out of jail, you're going to land more than likely on one of these properties. If you live within your means and invest within your means, guess what? Your chances of winning go way up. And it's the same way with life. If we look at our life as a puzzle box and we live within our means and we invest within our means and we create a plan, because honestly, The game of life is a lot like the game of Monopoly in that there is a chance. We don't know what's going to happen in the next roll. We are going to go through hardship. We're going to go through windfall. If you live long enough, you'll experience all that stuff. But the reality is this. If you'll prepare yourself and you'll not be monopolized by the things that you own, the likelihood of getting through this life with joy goes way up. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says these words. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction. And there will be many who enter in through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few that find it." And what he's saying if you really want to win at life, you have to be different from everybody else. Because crazy people want you on their train. Insane people love company. And we need to make sure that we're different from the world, that we see life differently from the world, and that we realize that we have a God of sufficiency and that His enough is enough. And that we can live a joyful life within the pieces that He's put in our puzzle box. And all that can happen if we'll refuse to be monopolized. I want you to imagine this with me for just a second. I want you to imagine being able to sleep at night because you don't have near as many worries as you used to have. I want you to imagine being able to afford to do some things that you thought you'd never be able to afford before. I want you to imagine being generous in ways that you never thought you could be generous before. And you can do all those things if you live within your means. If you see this puzzle box, you realize that you don't need anybody else's stuff, that God's enough.